topic for today's talk was partially inspired by some comments that Tay made at last year's retreat regarding the Lotus Sutra. And the topic that we're going to focus on today is bringing skillful means into our everyday lives and responding as needed in challenging circumstances. I think a logical starting point would be, I suspect many of you, if not most of you, have some familiarity with this term in a Buddhist context of skillful means. But I don't want to assume anything. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, let me start by offering a definition or two of skillful means. Another term that you'll hear in Buddhist context is expedient means, or upaya from the Sanskrit. The first definition that I found, which I like, is from the Oxford Dictionary of Buddhism, and it says that upaya, at root the concept of skillful means is the notion that the Buddha's teaching is essentially a provisional means to bring beings to enlightenment, and that the teachings he gives may vary. What may be appropriate at one time may not be appropriate at another time. And this is going to be a central theme as we go on over the next half hour to hour or so. The idea of adapting the teachings is needed based on the dispositions of the student or the people that might be interacting in a given situation. So we'll come back to that. A second definition that I found, which I liked a lot, was from Burton Watson's translation of the Lotus Sutra. And he defines expedient means as devices or temporary means adapted in order to relieve suffering and lead beings to enlightenment, often by offering provisional teachings as a means toward guiding them to the ultimate truth. And one of the things I liked about this definition is that it accommodates almost two different levels of skillful means. So we could talk about skillful means, or upaya, in a Buddhist context in a more narrow or technical way. And usually in that context, it's applied to a Buddhist teacher using skillful teaching devices to help lead a student toward attainment, toward freedom, toward nirvana. A second way that we can use the term is a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more general, perhaps a little bit more liberal. And that is, skillful means can be applied in everyday interactions, particularly where there is some potential conflict or difficulty that arises. And any Buddhist practitioner might, using or bringing an open mind, receptivity, and responsiveness to a situation, help to relieve others of their suffering. So it's a little bit less formally Buddhist, but I think for those of us who have taken the path of wanting to relieve suffering, we could stretch the meaning a little bit to accommodate that broader use of the term upaya. And that's going to be our focus as we go on today. Having spoken a little bit, again, to get us on the same page about skillful means, either as skillful teaching in a narrow Buddhist context or as acting skillfully in our everyday lives. Another question that we could ask beyond what are skillful means is, how do we apply or how do we actualize skillful means in our everyday lives? Okay? So stated another way, how do we put skillful means into practice? Particularly, what would it look like in the context of a difficult or challenging situation? And this, my friends, is a much more difficult question to answer for the simple reason that, and again, we could go back to that first definition, what may be appropriate at one time may not be appropriate at another. So, essentially, given that this is a Buddhist gathering, we can think about the teaching of interdependence and bring our understanding of interdependence to any challenging situation. And if we look deeply, what we're going to realize is that every situation, there are myriad causes and conditions at play. Okay, so psychologists, for example, talk about traits and states. So traits might be what we think of as personality. All of us have personalities that tend to be somewhat stable over time. Okay, this one might be an introvert, this one might be an extrovert, for example. And there's many, many traits that psychologists have studied. States are even more transient. So states I think of as being like the weather. So perhaps this morning you might have gotten up and checked your phone and seen something from the news that you found to be discouraging or that brought you sadness. And it's plausible that 5 minutes later you looked out the window and saw flowers blooming and trees in bloom, me struggling to breathe. No. But seeing the beauty of nature might have changed your state entirely to one of joy. So I mention this only to talk about, and then in a given situation we might have multiple personalities at play and different states of mind. And that's not even getting into environmental conditions or circumstances and contingencies that might be unfolding. To make this point, let me suggest a thought exercise. In this room, I suggest that if I were to say, could somebody come up and, for the next 5 minutes, describe for the group what a meditation practice such as the 4 Brahma Viharas look like, or the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Looking around this room, I think there's not less than 12.5 people who could come up here. We might have different styles of presenting it, but there would be a roadmap, if you will, a structure, a systematic progression that we would probably share in common. So we might start by talking about, well, what are the 4 Brahma Viharas? And we would explain in a Buddhist context what is meant by loving kindness, what is meant by compassion, what is meant by sympathetic joy and equanimity. We then might, following a very traditional progression, talk about how we start the practice, perhaps with ourselves. And then we might direct one of these positive states, these wholesome states of mind, toward a benefactor in our life. It might be a mother, it might be a favorite teacher, an aunt or uncle who showed you unconditional love, maybe even a pet. And then we would go on to talk about directing these wholesome states of mind toward a neutral person. It might be an acquaintance or a complete stranger. And then next we might talk about the difficult person or persons, the person who pushes our buttons, so to speak. We might even use a term like enemies. And then ultimately, we would talk about directing any one of these 4 wholesome states of mind toward all sentient beings. And the reason we could do this, and we could do the same thing with many other practices, including, for example, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, is because there is a structure, there is a systematic progression. If you will, there's a recipe, a roadmap that we can fall back on. But here's where the thought exercise comes in. If a spiritual friend or a student were to say to you, well, what should I do to respond skillfully? During a meeting at work where a person is becoming, let's say, angry and there's a difficult encounter, or if I'm out in public, let's say in a mass transit situation, and I witness one person perhaps becoming aggressive, belligerent, confrontational toward another person, prescriptive, prefabricated answers might not work in situations like that. Okay? In those situations, we need to bring a balanced sensitivity, a receptivity, and an openness of mind that would allow us to adapt to the unfolding circumstances with skill. So nobody can tell you ahead of time what might be the appropriate way to act at a given time. Precisely because there is no formulaic approach to skillful means, in Buddhist literature and teachings, often examples are used. And examples can be very, very instructive with regard to what skillful means might look like in everyday lives or in teaching situations. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the Lotus Sutra. The second chapter of the Lotus Sutra is titled Expedient Means. And in it, the Buddha speaks to his disciple or follower, who is not coincidentally Shariputra, who is known for his deep knowledge and for having a very brilliant mind. And the Buddha explains to Shariputra how important expedient means are for a Buddhist teacher or leader. I'm not going to go into those examples because many of you know the Lotus Sutra. It is and has been for many years a part of our Dharma study curriculum. And for those of you that are newer to the study curriculum, be assured that if you stay involved, you will get to the Lotus Sutra. But the skillful means exemplified in that book are so wonderful. People have written entire books just looking at the parables in the Lotus Sutra whereby skillful means or expedient means are demonstrated. Another potential source of skillful means, which might be less known to some of you, are the writings of Peter Hirschak. Peter Hirschak wrote a delightful little paperback called Chan Buddhism, and many of you, I'm sure, are aware. In the West, we tend to know this tradition as Zen Buddhism, but in China it was known as Chan Buddhism. And he has several other books as well that brilliantly illustrate interactions between teachers and students, dynamic interactions, whereby the teacher met the student where he or she was at in that given moment and helped point them toward awakening and to help relieve them from suffering. In fact, he put so much emphasis on it, there are two terms that he uses quite a bit in his writings. One, he actually wrote one of his earliest books on, is called Liberating Intimacy. And of course, intimacy implies two or more. And the other term he uses quite a bit, borrowing from a metaphor from the world of music, is social virtuosity. So one of the backdrops to, and by the way, I should mention one of the things I admire in Peter Herschak's writings is he is a scholar of Buddhism, but he is a scholar practitioner. In fact, I would even go so far as to say a practitioner scholar. He is a student of Korean Zen and writes and has deep knowledge of the history of Chinese Buddhism and of Japanese Buddhism. But unlike some scholars where occasionally you'll read their works and it feels like somebody's looking from the outside in, he writes with the voice and the spirit of a practitioner, from the inside out, if you will. So I think he brings a very balanced perspective to Buddhism. And one of the things that he addresses in his writings is this misconception that Zen is primarily about meditation, but to the degree that it almost starts to look to the outsider like avoidance, like a retreat from everyday life, like sidestepping the world to go into a cave or into a temple, to focus predominantly on one's inward development. Now, I want to be clear here so I don't misrepresent Herschak's writings. He does not mean to imply that meditation is not important. Okay, he would say it's a critical part of Zen in any Buddhist tradition. And I would wholeheartedly agree with that. But what he tries to do is offer a more balanced perspective about sort of these two polarities, if you will, in our practice. And I want to briefly read you two excerpts from his writing. He's a beautiful writer, and I will defer to his words to make his point rather than my own. Contrary to the Indian ascetic, the Chinese sage is someone who not only does not forfeit his or her particular place in the web of human relationships, he or she takes the task of correcting relations with others as his or her primary concern. Thus, in China, birth is not seen as a loss of freedom, but as entering into an intimate and enabling embrace with others. Ending suffering is not an escape from or transcendence of relationships, but the process of rendering them appropriate. In this sense, freedom is akin to virtuosic musicianship, skill in responding to disruptive circumstances in a creative and harmonious way. In the second passage, enlightenment has to do with relationship, not with any one individual's attainment alone. And in particular, with the kinds of relationship in which everything is at stake and nothing is excluded as impossible. In short, Chan enlightenment should not be seen as private in nature, but is intimately social. Herschak, at many points in his books, builds upon this idea of virtuosity. In fact, he often uses the metaphor of jazz musicians improvising as they're riffing with other musicians. So, of course, in classical music, by contrast, there are notes that appear ahead of time that are indeed pre-thought and prescriptive in nature, if you will. There might be slight differences in interpretation among artists, but it's not like the responsiveness that skilled jazz musicians demonstrate when they are improvising together with other musicians, not knowing what notes they're going to play in a given moment, but responding with an open sensitivity to what arises and unfolds musically. And he uses that analogy for what Zen masters do in their teaching relationships. I encourage you, if you are interested in the history of Zen Buddhism and seeing some of these teaching exemplars beautifully written about, to look at the writings of Peter Hirschach. But rather than share some of those specific examples with you, I'm going to propose to take us in a slightly different direction for the remainder of this hour. What I'd like us to do is contemplate examples of skillful means in everyday life, if you will, that second level of the way we might use this term. And what I have done is I've gathered up some examples, some anecdotes, some stories from many writings and audio teachings that have left an impression with me over the years. And I'm hoping that some of these resonate with you as much as they have with me. So probably all of you have had the experience of reading a book, and years later you're impressed with how little of it you remember. Okay? It never happens to me. But some of these are the one thing that I do remember years later. Okay? And reflecting on Tay's comments last year around the Lotus Sutra, even that day I was starting in my mind to think about commonalities, if you were to connect the dots among these anecdotes. So what I'm going to propose that we do is approach this as guided contemplations or reflections. So what I will do in a few moments, I'm going to ring the bell 3 times, and I'm going to give us perhaps 2 minutes or so to just settle in, okay? Mindfulness of breathing, for example, would be a wonderful practice here, just to anchor yourself and stabilize yourself in your body and in your mind. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce these stories or these anecdotes one at a time. I'm going to suggest that you close your eyes for these, and what I will do is I will, before reading the author's recollections, their words, I'll give you just a few sentences of background information or context to help you know a little bit more about the situation that I'm hoping in your mind's eye you would try and imagine in the here and now as if it were unfolding before you. And that's why I would suggest perhaps doing this with your eyes closed. I think visualizations work a little better when our eyes are closed. And I will read these stories, these anecdotes, one at a time. And after I finish each one, I'm going to ring the bell and just give us a few moments for to contemplate or reflect upon the anecdote that you just listened to. So it's an opportunity to practice deep listening. And as I said, in your mind's eye, perhaps bringing the scenario to mind. There's 2 ways you might approach this. One, which is more analytical, would be to ask yourself, and again, as I've said, our premise here is that to act skillfully in a given situation, to go in with preconceived ideas might actually be detrimental and escalate a difficult situation. So, but you might reflect upon what state of mind would a practitioner need to cultivate to respond as gracefully as these people do? And by the way, all of these examples, with one exception, are relatively contemporary. Each of these, with the one exception, has taken place within my lifetime. The other approach you could take, which is actually the one I think I would favor or endorse, is to not approach this analytically, but to rather bear witness to any feelings that might arise as you're bearing witness to these stories. Okay, so in other words, let any feelings or emotions wash over you, and just practice being in contact with your own feelings as you hear these. Okay? And we'll settle for a few minutes reflecting either analytically or perhaps just letting the anecdote wash over us softly, and then I will ring the bell and return to another story or anecdote. At the end, I'll have just a few comments to wrap up my talk. And then what I will do is I will invite Venerable Thich Tree Hong to share any comments he might have on this idea of expedient means, or any of the scenarios that I'm about to share with you. And we'll see, if time allows, we can open it up to questions and comments as well. Okay? So with that, why don't you assume a posture that lends itself to sitting and guided contemplations. A furious father. This anecdote illustrates skillfully responding to anger. Some background. Tibetan Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron is speaking about people who write to her about their practice of Tonglen meditation. Tonglen meditation, as many of you know, involves visualizing and breathing in suffering, our own and or others, and then transforming it as we breathe out an antidote to the suffering, whatever might bring relief. The following are Pema Chodron's words from her audio teaching, Good Medicine, regarding Tonglen meditation. So a man wrote to me. He said he was a high school counselor. In his position as a counselor, he had supported a young teenage woman in her decision to leave her father's home and move in with her mother. Then the man got a phone call from the father. As he described the father in the letter, I imagined him as a guy who was 6'8" and weighed about 800 pounds. And I imagined this guy who wrote the letter as being about 4'2" and weighing about 25 pounds. This is the situation the man felt himself to be in. And he said the father was an ex-cop who had been removed from the police force because of his aggression. So this was the man that was going to come in and have a little discussion with him about the fact that he had counseled the daughter to move out of the former policeman's home. The counselor knew this man was angry, and sure enough, when he arrived, the guy was really angry. The man came in and sat across from him and just vented. He was furious. And the man who wrote the letter said that he sat there absolutely terrified. But he said that he was so terrified that he stopped thinking about anything. He was just there with the angry man. And then, for some reason, he started to do Tonglen. He said he just started breathing in his own fear and pain and this man's pain. Sort of both at once. He said he really didn't think about it, but there was just so much pain in the room that he just started breathing in and out, and breathing in and breathing out. And the man was screaming and red in the face and ultimately shaking his fist. All of a sudden, the counselor who wrote the letter said that out of his mouth these words came: "You must love your daughter a lot to be so upset." And he said then, this great big man just broke down and started to cry. The counselor wrote that usually he would have felt the need to defend himself. He would have felt like he had to protect himself. He would have done all that stuff that would be guaranteed to escalate the aggression in the room, because that's just our ordinary response. It's like we're so scared and we feel so disempowered by what's going on that we try to build ourselves up. And we say all the things that just further the aggression and pain. But this counselor didn't dream up what to say. He just created some kind of space. And there, involuntarily, it just happened. And the words came out that communicated from his heart. You must really love your daughter a lot. A eulogy for murdered friends. This passage illustrates skillfully responding to hatred. Context. Vietnamese-born nun Sister Chan Kong describes preparing a eulogy after the murder of several of her friends and fellow members of the School of Youth for Social Services during the war in Vietnam. She knew that members of the warring factions who had killed her friends were likely to be in the audience during the funeral service. These words are from her autobiography, Learning True Love. We had to take care of the wounded and also to organize funerals for our friends who had died. Tay Tan Van asked me to write a speech for him to read at the funeral. After one day of mindfulness by myself, I wrote this eulogy, which was delivered by Tay. We cannot hate you, you who have thrown grenades and killed our friends, because we know that men are not our enemies. Our only enemies are the misunderstanding, hatred, jealousy, and ignorance that lead to such acts of violence. Please allow us to remove all misunderstanding so we can work together for the happiness of the Vietnamese people. Our only aim is to help remove ignorance and illiteracy from the countryside of Vietnam. Social change must start in our hearts with the will to transform our own egotism and lust into understanding, love, commitment, and sharing responsibility for the poverty and injustice in our country. Many important guests, Catholics, Protestants, Buddhists, conservatives, and progressives, were moved by the speech. After that, the eldest monks of the Unified Buddhist Church offered their support for our work. Our only enemies are misunderstanding, hatred, and ignorance. Appealing to innate goodness. This passage illustrates skillfully responding to a threat. Background. During the war in Vietnam, Sister Chan Kong was asked by the Minister of Education to sign a petition condemning the communists. The minister threatened her with arrest by the police and immediate loss of her coveted university teaching position if she refused to sign the petition. The following are Chan Kong's words. I breathed deeply and said in a very firm voice, "Sir, I came to you today because I know that you were once a professor, my elder brother in teaching. When you speak in such a threatening way, it is impossible for us to have real communication. So do what you want with me. Please, feel free to send me to jail." With tears in my eyes, I continued more gently, "Sir, I am like a bamboo shoot among university teachers. I am young, but my spirit may grow strong and beautiful." I spoke out frantically against the situation of the country, not for my own sake, but for the sake of the nation, even though prison may await me as a result. I appeal to your conscience as an elder brother to help me grow in this attitude, not to bow before coercion. Don't force me to go against my conscience. If I were to agree to sign your petition under threat of violence, then tonight, if unknown men enter my house with guns and were to force me to sign a petition saying, "Long live Mao Zedong," must I not also sign that? If I sign under the threat of guns against my conscience and belief, who will be at fault? Do you really want to teach me that way of coercion? He seemed embarrassed, and his attitude changed immediately. He said that I had misunderstood him, that he only wanted to protect me, Then he let me go without signing anything, and the police never came to arrest me. Apparently, he protected me from the police. Elder brother, please help me to grow. An absence of volunteers. This story illustrates skillfully promoting compassionate engagement. Background information. Joanna Macy is a Buddhist activist for ecology and social justice. The following describes a meeting during which she attempted to promote a sense of advocacy for the environment by asking those present to consider their responsibilities to future generations. The following passage is from Joanna Macy's book, World is Lover, World is Self. The only final solution for high-level nuclear waste that our government can come up with is to hide it, out of sight and out of mind, in deep geological repositories. Although this strategy makes leaking containers inaccessible for repairs. Seeking to generate alternative responses to nuclear waste, I have experimented with ways that would help people to experience, at a gut level, its ongoingness through time. On one occasion, at an ad hoc People's Council in New Mexico, when discussion about the waste was limited to wishing it away, I pulled out a small tape recorder. Let's imagine, I said, that if we can't stop the waste from going into the Carlsbad repository, we can at least place this cassette there, on the surface, for future generations to find and to listen to. What do we want to say to them? Passing the recorder among them, the men and women began to speak into it. My name is George. I'm back in the late 20th century, and I'm trying to stop them from burying this radioactive waste. If you can find this, and you can hear this, listen. This stuff is dangerous. Don't dig here. It's deadly. Take care. As the words came, the distant, unborn ones to whom they were addressed became more and more real to us. We began to inhabit large stretches of time. Understanding arose that the wastes should be kept in an invisible, repairable, ground-level storage unit, and several young people in the group volunteered to live and work at such a guardian site. What do we want to say to them? A vocal protester, this memory illustrates skillfully responding to anger and confusion. Background context. The following event was recalled by James Forrest in a chapter titled, Nhat Hanh, Seeing with the Eyes of Compassion. This chapter can be found toward the end of Thich Nhat Hanh's book, The Miracle of Mindfulness. But there was one evening when Nhat Hanh awoke, not understanding, but rather the measureless rage of one American. He had been talking in the auditorium of a wealthy Christian church in a St. Louis suburb. As always, Tay emphasized the need for Americans to stop their bombing and killing in his country. There had been questions and answers when a large man stood up and spoke with searing scorn of the supposed compassion of this Mr. Hanh. If you care so much about your people, Mr. Hanh, why are you here? If you care so much for the people who are wounded, why don't you spend your time with them? At this point, my recollection of his words is replaced by the memory of the intense anger he expressed, which overwhelmed me. When he finished, I looked toward Nhat Hanh in bewilderment. What could he or anyone say? The spirit of the war had suddenly filled the room, and it seemed hard to breathe. There was a silence. Then Tay began to speak, quietly, with deep calm, indeed with a sense of personal caring for the man who had just damned him. The words seemed like rain falling on fire. If you want the tree to grow, he said, it won't help to water the leaves. You have to water the roots. Many of the roots of the war in Vietnam are here in your country. To help the people who are to be bombed, to try to protect them from this suffering, I have come here. The atmosphere in the room was transformed. In the man's fury, we had experienced our own furies. We had seen the world as through a bomb bay. In Nhat Hanh's response, we had experienced an alternate possibility. The possibility, here brought to Christians by a Buddhist and to Americans by a so-called enemy, of overcoming hatred with love, of breaking the seemingly endless chain reaction of violence throughout human history. To protect them from suffering. An irresponsible nephew. This story illustrates skillfully responding to confusion. Background. Ryokan was a beloved Japanese priest and Zen poet who was born in the 17th century. The telling of this event is adapted from two books, The Great Fool by Ryochi Abe and Peter Haskell, and Three Zen Masters by John Stevens. Ryokan's nephew had begun to indulge in a life of delinquency and would not listen to anyone's advice. In desperation, his mother asked Ryokan to admonish him. Ryokan went to the family's house and stayed there for 3 days, yet he remained speechless, not knowing what to say to the boy. Finally, when the time came for Ryokan to depart, he called his nephew to help him tie his straw sandals. Thinking that Ryokan was at last about to begin preaching to her son, the young man's mother hid behind a screen and listened. As the boy was tying Ryokan's sandals, he felt a cold sensation on his back. Looking up, he realized that it was the tears falling from Ryokan's eyes. Suddenly, the nephew recovered his senses. Ryokan stood up and, still silent, departed. Ryokan left the area, and the boy had a complete change of heart. Tears falling. And the last story, Danger on a Train. This memory illustrates skillfully responding to aggression. This passage, titled A Soft Answer, was written by Terry Dobson, a teacher of Aikido. Aikido, a Japanese martial art with spiritual ties to Zen Buddhism, was derived from Jiu-Jitsu, a name that means gentle art. A turning point came in my life one day on a train in the suburbs of Tokyo. In the middle of a drowsy spring afternoon, the old car clanked and rattled over the rails. At one station, the doors opened, and suddenly the quiet afternoon was shattered by a man bellowing at the top of his lungs, yelling violent, obscene, incomprehensible curses. Just as the doors closed, the man who was still yelling staggered into our car. He was big, drunk, and dirty. He wore laborer's clothing. His front was stiff with dried vomit. His eyes bugged out, a demonic neon red. His hair was crusted with filth. Screaming, he swung at the first person he saw, a woman holding a baby. The blow glanced off her shoulder, sending her spinning into the laps of an elderly couple. It was a miracle that the baby was unharmed. The couple jumped up and scrambled toward the other end of the car. They were terrified. The laborer aimed a kick at the retreating back of the old lady. "You old whore," he bellowed. "I'll kick your ass." The train lurched ahead, the passengers frozen with fear. I stood up. I was young and in pretty good shape in those days. I stood 6 feet tall and weighed about 225 pounds. I'd been putting in a solid 8 hours of Aikido training every day for the past 3 years. I thought I was tough. Trouble was, my martial arts skills were untested in actual combat. As students of Aikido, we were not allowed to fight. My teacher, the founder of Aikido, taught us each morning that the art was devoted to peace. Aikido, he said again and again, is the art of reconciliation. Whoever has the mind to fight has broken his connection with the universe. If you try to dominate other people, you are already defeated. We study Aikido to learn how to resolve conflict, not how to start it. In my heart of hearts, however, I was dying to be a hero. I wanted a chance, an absolutely legitimate opportunity, whereby I might save some innocent person by destroying the guilty. This is it, I said to myself as I got to my feet. This slob, this animal, this drunk is mean and violent. People are in danger. If I don't do something fast, somebody will probably get hurt. Seeing me stand, the drunk saw a chance to focus his rage. "Ah," he roared, "a foreigner! You need a lesson in Japanese manners." A split second before he moved, someone shouted, "Hey!" It was ear-splitting. I remember being hit by the strangely joyous, lifting quality of it. "Hey!" Now, we both stared down at a little old Japanese man. He must have been well into his 70s, this tiny gentleman, sitting there. He took no notice of me, but beamed delightedly at the laborer, as though he had a most important, most welcome secret to share. "Come here," the old man said in an easy vernacular, beckoning to the drunk. "Come here and talk with me." He waved his hand lightly. The big man followed as if on a string. He planted his feet belligerently in front of the old gentleman and towered threateningly over him. "Talk to you," he roared above the clanking wheels. "Why the hell should I talk to you?" The drunk now had his back to me. If his elbows moved so much as a millimeter, I'd drop him. The old man continued to beam at the laborer. There was not a trace of fear or resentment about him. "What you been drinking?" he asked lightly, his eyes sparkling with interest. "I've been drinking sake," the laborer bellowed back, "and it's none of your damn business." "Oh, that's wonderful," the old man said with delight. "Absolutely wonderful. You see, I love sake too. Every night, me and my wife, she's 76, you know, we warm up a little bottle of sake and take it out into the garden. And we sit on the old wooden bench. We look to see our plum tree and how it's doing. My grandfather planted that tree, you know, and we worry about whether it will recover from those ice storms we had last winter." He looked up at the laborer, eyes twinkling, happy to share his delightful information. As he struggled to follow the intricacies of the old man's conversation, the drunk man's face began to soften. His fist slowly unclenched. "Yeah," he said slowly, "I love plums too." His voice trailed off. "Yes," said the old man, smiling, "and I'm sure you have a wonderful wife." "No," replied the laborer. "My wife died." He hung his head. Very gently, swaying with the motion of the train, the big man began to sob. "I don't got no wife, don't got no home, I don't got no job, I don't got no money, I don't got nowhere to go. I'm so ashamed of myself." Tears rolled down his cheeks. A spasm of pure despair rippled through his body. Standing there in my make this world safe for democracy righteousness, I suddenly felt dirtier than he was. Just then the train arrived at my stop. Maneuvering my way out of the train, I heard the old man. My, he said, "that is a very difficult predicament indeed. Sit down here and tell me about it." The laborer was sprawled like a sack on the seat, his head in the old man's lap. The old man looked down at him with compassion, one hand stroking his filthy, matted head. As the train pulled away, I sat down on a bench. What I had wanted to do with muscle and meanness had just been accomplished with a few kind words. I had seen Aikido, and the essence of it was love, as the founder had said. Sit down and tell me about it. And now take just a minute or two to settle back into mindfulness of breathing. And that finishes the guided contemplations. Some of my friends from Connecticut know that one of my favorite books in the world that I've presented on and for the Connecticut Sangha, or with the Connecticut Sangha, is the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. And one of the many lines in there that I found inspiring over the years is, "The sage brings people back to what they have lost." The sage brings people back to what they have lost. As these stories illustrate, Skillful Means is not just restricted to formal teaching situations between teacher and student, but can also be enacted in our everyday lives. So we saw a frightened teacher gracefully bringing a father back to the issue at hand, which was the daughter that they both cared for. We saw Sister Chan Kong helping warring factions and parties to come back to their common and shared humanity. We also saw Sister Chan Kong helping a high-ranking public official who had threatened to have her arrested, to help bring him back to his sensibilities as a teacher and as an elder, bringing him back to his sense of dignity and integrity and humility. We saw Thich Nhat Hanh during the Vietnam War helping to guide an audience of Americans, at least one of whom was hostile, into looking deeply at the roots of the war. And again, bringing people back to their shared or common humanity. We saw my favorite poet, Rokan, not acting in his formal capacity as a Zen priest, but as a loving uncle, without words, helping to bring his nephew back to his sense of responsibility and filial piety, which he had lost. And then finally we saw a little old man, a stranger on the train, skillfully dealing with a man who was aggressive, who was belligerent, who was confrontational, by looking deeply into that man's heart and sensing his humanity and bringing him back to touch his own suffering, to bear witness to his own grief, and thereby diverting the situation from one of potential further aggression that could have ended up with people being seriously hurt. The sage brings people back to what they have lost. So, consistent with Peter Haskell's writings that try and restore a sense that while meditation is critical to our practice is actualized in many ways off the cushion, and we need to have this balance. Images can be very powerful. Many people, when they think of Buddhism, when they think of Zen, what comes to mind is Shakyamuni Buddha, perhaps sitting in meditation, a beautiful image of peacefulness. Or I remember when I was in my early years of studies with Tay at the Heian Pagoda, there was a picture of Bodhidharma there, okay, who sat 9 years in front of a wall. And by the way, Dave, since I saw you last, you're looking a lot more like Bodhidharma.
I know, right?
You need a bag of steak.
Huh?
You need a bag of steak.
Yeah.
And of course, the popular conception of meditation is apt to come from a magazine picture of maybe somebody sitting with very, very restrictive tights on, all blissed out. And this perception is out there. And again, I will say it for emphasis, this is not to minimize the importance of meditation in our practice. But I will bring or evoke an image that I hope many of you are familiar with from the 10 ox herding pictures. And in the 10th picture from that series it represents stages of practice, if you will. In the final picture, Hotai, the laughing Buddha, who's been appropriated in cultural means to represent wealth and good fortune. In a deeper sense, in that final picture, what it represents is bringing our sense of wisdom, compassion, and insight into the bustling marketplace. And Hotai is smiling, carrying a sack that's reputed to be filled with toys for the children. And he interacts with merchants and he interacts with everyday people. And I think that would help to balance these other wonderful images of Buddhist figures sitting quietly in meditation. And I think it's in the everyday hustle and bustle of the marketplace of our everyday lives where we can best actualize our bodhisattva intentions, our aspirations. And I'll close by reminding you of our first bodhisattva precept. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them. And doing that is not a matter of quietude or bowing out from the world, but rather stepping back into it and doing the best we can with an open and receptive mind. So I thank all of you for your attention. I want to invite my teacher of 23 years now, the Venerable Ting Shui Huang, to share any comments or corrections.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful talk about skillful means. And yeah, you take the chapter from the Lotus Sutra, and some people haven't know about that chapter, so I just briefly tell you about that. Is that in that chapter, the Buddha saw that the children play in their own house, and that house was a golf fight. So he saw the danger of the children, and he tried to call the children out of that house. That's the fire on the top floor. But the children just don't know what the danger means. So they continue to play in that house. And at the end, he tried to find out what the children like. Oh, the children like the toy, the car. And he says, oh, children, come out, I give you the buffalo car, I give you the deer car, I give you the horse car. And when the children heard that, they all ran out. And then he gave each of them a beautiful big car. So the people think that the Buddha was telling lie, didn't give exactly what he told the children. But that kind of, what he told to the children is just, he used a skillful means to attract the people out of the danger. And that is the practice of the Bodhisattva, very important practice. Skillful means that you can use any kind of means, if though the means is not harmful to any living being, in order to awaken the people or to help the people, to free the people from the suffering that counts. In the Buddhist story, in the Zen masters use sometimes beat the student in order to help the student to get enlightenment. One day was student come to the Zen master and said, after the master explained about the Heart Sutra, and the student said, oh, I understand everything about the Heart Sutra. No eye, no ear, no tongue, no you, no me, no practice, no vegetarian, no precept, nothing. Everything empty, the emptiness. So after the student was finished talking, the master said, come close to me. And he take his finger to hold the nose of the student tightly and twist it. And the student shout laughing. So he said, who shout? No, you know me, who shout? So he didn't mean to hurt the student, but to awake the student by using that means, that skillful means. And another, in the Zen, you will see a lot of story like that. The story of two Zen monks went to the city, and they have to cross the creek. So after the heavy rain, the water flow the current very strong. So they saw that one girl in the church trying to cross the creek, but the water is so strong, so she don't dare to walk into the water. So one of the monks was offered the shoulder for that lady and carried that lady across the river to other side. And they went to the city. The other monk, after that, didn't say anything, just keep quiet. And after they finished the thing in the city, they went back to the temple. When come close to the temple, the other monk said to his friend, you are the monk, you supposed not to touch the woman. And the monk who carries the lady said, yes, I do carry that lady across the river, but I put her down on the bank of the river, but you still carry her until here. So that story means that sometimes the precept, we have to keep the precept. But in some case, we have to break the precept. If for the sake of the freeing the people from the suffering, in the sake of compassion, then it's not considered breaking the precept. So that is that's why if you study about if you read more about the 6 paramita, then you will see that we practice everything, but we do not attach to anything. Just like the first paramita, that means the dana, we will not mind how much we give, to whom we give, and we do not expect anything in return. So that is the practice of the paramita. So non-attachment. So the unskillful means, that is any means we can use, if based on the compassion and wisdom, that do not consider as the breaking the precept. In our daily life, we have sometimes we have to use the skillful means. For example, during the war, if the soldier, it does not matter soldier from which side, were wounded, come to your house and try to ask for help. And later, another group come and ask you, did you see that soldier? And of course, you have to say no. No, I don't see that. I don't see that soldier. Or said, oh, that soldier just run to that way. Yeah. So in order to save the life of that person, then we have to tell him lie. And that is the skillful means. Out of compassion, out of wisdom, we do not consider it as breaking the precept. In the office also, sometimes if someone talk about somebody else, and then of course, in some case you have to tell him lie. You know that will not make the problem worse. So that is it's something that it happens. So the skillful means is a practice, important practice of the Bodhisattva, in order to to help the living being, to free them from the suffering, and so for that purpose, what is not against the precept, do not consider it a breach in the precept. Do you have any question, any comment? Yes.
Clearly, you've done a really great job in teaching on what it really means. Really awesome talk. For me, the theme was that in each circumstance, the person that was dealing with the difficult situation was able to really go into the very depth of who they were and identify what the pain was that was inside the other person. Then the next leap in all of that, because we can talk about this, we present more and more circumstances, but then how do you get to that point where you have the empathy for the other person? What is that practice? And clearly you have taught him with the way that you've taught him. And my understanding of it is really that you have to go deeply within yourself and really understand what your wounds are. You really have to be really honest with yourself to the nth degree and trust and have wonderful people in your life and show you who you are, who are really honest with you and who are really loving, and when they present to you, whether it's this or something else, that you know that they have the wisdom to really see exactly what you need at that moment so that you can go deeper within yourself. But the key to it is to really trust that process and to go as deeply as possible within yourself and to be totally honest with yourself, and then express as much as you can about to the other person within their ability to understand it, but always leaving yourself open and vulnerable, because that's what each one of them did. Each one of them heard the other person in here and then was totally vulnerable with them, and what happened then was this uniting of the heart, which then moves the energy. And whether that is through meditation and understanding that, because meditation is really essential, because that way you get outside of it in order to understand, so that you can go back in and see yourself. But then the other piece of it is that you have to live it and practice it, because if you don't practice it, it's just talk. And then it comes from here rather than from here. And these two have to be integrated. And it was a wonderful talk, and clearly you've taught him really well, because he's able to do that. Because he couldn't have talked about it so deeply if he didn't understand it, because that's what he conveyed to all of us. So I'm grateful to you. And to the rest of the room here.
So my observation is throughout all those stories, I see like the common theme is you don't react right away. We try to relate, try to be in whoever's shoes and find a commonality. And that is a bridge that allows you to be compassionate easier.
May I just share both of your comments? Reflect. This morning I was watching, I often have the CBS morning show on in the background when I'm getting ready. And of course I had already during the week prepared these 7 anecdotes or stories. And I heard this piece, this woman who was kidnapped in East Africa during a tour. It was either a safari or a bus tour, something like that, and was kidnapped at gunpoint. And I thought to myself, this could have been the 8th vignette. And to both of your points, so she started the story, of course, this was during an interview, she related it to Gail King. She was terrified, utterly terrified. But what she said was, as this situation was first evolving, one of the young men who grabbed her and forcefully led her away, she could feel that his arm was trembling. And it was through her fear that she was able to connect with his. So I appreciate your insight. And it went on. That first night, she was still terrified, but she decided, I'm going to connect with them as people. And some of it was in her own interest. She said, I want them to see me as a person. So she looked out over the East African sky, and she said, truly, as terrified as she was, I had never seen a more beautiful sunset in my life. And she said to her captors, that sunset is the most beautiful I've ever seen. We don't have colors like that where I'm from. And she continued to relate to them like that. Another anecdote that she shared was at one point she saw these young men literally getting on the ground and drinking from a dirty puddle. And she said it occurred to her, much of their lives they probably did not have clean potable water. And that was the suffering and hardship they were from. And it went on, and they didn't get the ransom they were looking for, but whatever company was commercially running this safari tour did pay some small amount. And as she was leaving, the young men who had captured her said to her, well, at least one of them did, will you keep in touch with us? Will you keep in touch with us? And she said, I just was able to relate to them as human beings. And any of you that watched the show, I'll just add this as a footnote. I really didn't intend to talk more, but I couldn't resist because this anecdote fits so well with our theme. Gail King, who was the interviewer, has interviewed all sorts of world figures and amazing people. And she said, I was utterly awestruck by this woman. The woman is, she takes care of skin, an
Esthetician.
Thank you, esthetician. Beyond my wheelhouse. But she said, I was utterly blown away by this woman's presence and ability to connect with them as people. And John Dickerson, who's another host, said, there's probably a deep spirituality there. I wish it would have been interesting to find out, but ultimately it doesn't really matter.
That is spirituality.
I agree. Yeah.
That is, and that's what the Buddha said. I mean, that's the whole teaching, in a nutshell.
So, my thanks to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I always learn so much. And the other thing that struck me in the story, in addition to the compassion and insight that both of you have brought, is that the people stopped thinking about themselves. They, in all of them, they got out of, I'm insulted, I'm scared, I'm this, I'm that, and were able to just recognize this other human being there and what the other human being, where they were and what they brought. And that's, I think, always so powerful. So thank you again for reminding us.
I also want to thank you. And you all see how our Connecticut Sangha so fortunate to have a leadership. You all heard today. We feel so grateful to have wonderful leadership for Connecticut Sangha. The day Fernando brought him to our class, I remember that you brought us more light for the DTO Connecticut. So thank you. And always whatever he speaks, so much wisdom in it. I think his maybe profession as a professor, it's more very skillful. And all that story, oh my goodness, so wonderfully you put together. I like to pick just one, last one you said. The story, come here, tell me all about it. That sums up all the story you tell us. Well, how many? 6, 7?
7.
Deep listening. That you mentioned that many times. We really don't listen to each other. We really don't. So many people heartbroken in many ways. Nobody really care for. They need someone to listen for them. We don't really listen, including myself. We don't really listen to each other much. And that sums up how we can really open our heart a little more to listen. At least DTO practitioner, maybe a little more we can to practice for that. And thank you. I always appreciate your leadership for Connecticut Sangha. And now you are all the different state of Sangha leadership. Thank you so much. We are blessed.
My old friend Elena.
Thank you, Richard. I apologize for being late. I had a work day, sort of. But I'm sorry I missed most of your talk, and I would really appreciate it if you could share some of your wisdom later on. But one part that really struck my heart very gently and very soothing was when you spoke about Hotai and how Hotai comes with his big bag and he goes through markets and he connects with people and he brings goodies and that the meditation is not just on the cushion, but meditation is a way of living, not just a way of life, but a way of being in life. And I was really happy to hear that. I just came back and I'm bringing greetings from Pace Sangha in Houston. I saw your picture.
We did.
Yes. I was in Texas for a trainers event for the week, and I was so happy that I really wanted to go to Taste Temple, and one of the people volunteered to drive me there, and there were like about 3 of them, and they never knew that the temple existed there. And so, and that's the meditation in action, the meditation in being, in doing. They committed themselves to coming to the temple because they felt so in awe that this beautiful temple is there. And so it was really, really wonderful to be there and to see the Sangha. People at different stages of understanding of Buddhism. They were all integrated, connected, and doing their meditation in their own way for their own benefits, and yet they were very supportive of each other. So that was very, very pleasing, very grateful I was to have been there, and grateful to Sister in whose name I didn't quite catch. Yeah, and she was so graceful, so wonderful, and so I was able to practice meditation there with the Sangha. So that was meditation at work. So thank you very much. I think Hotai did his job.
I have the growing paunch.
Yeah, so that we call the Buddha of the future.
I'm just going to say that dinner, is in 5 minutes, just to give you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
I told you, it's another meal is coming.
You're right.
And during this meal, there is a Connecticut Sangha meeting.
Is it? Okay.
You know, there's not very many people, I don't think, in the retreat. We could probably just meet, instead of the Antioch room, which is up here, we could probably just meet in that little area,
river
in
room?
the quiet room
Okay.
behind,
Yeah.
right in the cafeteria,
And when is it then?
during dinner.
During dinner.
During
Yeah.
dinner, so or should we bring our dinner to the
Bring your dinner.
Yeah,
room?
we'll eat dinner together.
Okay.